G'day, Bevan Addison here again from my very flash lab, also known as my back shed. And today we're going to talk to you about how to do a jar test. So when mixing chemicals, lots of times people say, oh, do a jar test. But what does that actually mean? So with a jar test, we're trying to replicate what's going to happen in your boom spray. Now, there's no way we can possibly do that with all the other pressures that go on inside that big machine. But at least this gives you an idea of whether something is fundamentally physically compatible. So just like cooking a cake in a kitchen, make sure that you've got all your ingredients here ready to go and you've got some measuring devices. So I do my jar tests in a jar, cheap $3 spaghetti jars from Coles, got some scales, got some syringes and all your product and some spare water. Now I've pre-weighed my granules. You need a calculator to make sure you can calculate the ratios that you need, and you need to download one of our mixing order charts from the website so that you make sure you set it up in the right order. So first thing you have to do is work out the ratios that you need. So if you're going out and spraying at something like 75 litres per hectare of water, all the product that you are going to use in your brew on the rate per hectare needs to be divided by 75. Okay, so in this instance, we're going to do a mix of a kilo of atrazine, a litre of propyzamide. We're going to put some insecticide in, an EC insecticide at about 300 mils, and we're going to put in 1.2 litres of our Wipeout 450 glyphosate. So that's how much I need of each of those things. So do that calculation beforehand, work out what you need to do. Fill your jar about 60-70% full and drop your granules in. And as you see, these granules, they don't actually dissolve in water, they disperse. They're called water dispersible granules. So you can see that as they float down through the water profile, that they bloom and they're sort of dispersing as they go. Now that's going to take a couple of minutes. You probably should allow 5 or so minutes to get that right. So I'll put that aside, and here's one that I did about 5 minutes ago. And that is my special patented mixing stick as well. So that is well and truly dissolved. So the next thing, or dispersed, the next thing in there is our propyzamide. So you can see that milky formulation, that's an SC formulation. So that's a suspension concentrate. So again, they are not actually dissolved, they are suspended. A bit like the granules, only they're in a more liquid form. So we need 13.3 mils, doesn't have to be precise. So in my syringe, I'll just go 13 mils. Whack that in there and give it a bit of a stir. So as your boom is working and you're putting this into your boom, you'll be getting agitation. And it's really important that your agitation is sufficient without going over the top. So some of these boom sprays, it's like having 5 fire extinguishers squirting around in there, and they're foaming and shooting around all over the place and making a really big foamy mess in there. So that when you go to put your EC in there, you've just got chemical landing, an oily based chemical which doesn't like mixing in water, landing on a big foamy mess. So you get your EC in next because that's the correct mixing order. Again, give it a stir. The oil-based doesn't really want to mix in to water, and it doesn't really want to mix in with those other chemicals. So once that's been agitated, then we go with the glyphosate in there. Again, we're going at 1.2 litres, so that's 16 mils. So I've got my syringe in here. If you haven't got syringes and you do any of this stuff, you can easily get them online. There's 16 mils. Whack that in there, give it another stir, some agitation there, and then just top it up to the right rate. So if we look at that, that's a relatively, not a super heavy-handed brew, but relatively concentrated brew. And if you keep that agitating, that's working. So people go, great, that's nice and easy. Where do we go wrong when we have a brew like that goes wrong in our boom spray? When you start to put it into your boom, you may not be allowing your granules to dissolve to the same level that you, or disperse to the same level as you did in here. So that's point one. You've got to give them time. You may not have got the mixing order quite right. So if you get oil and granules trying to mix together, they don't work very well. The other thing that a lot of people have these days, because of time constraints, etc., is a premix vat, which is a great idea. You get various sizes, but if you've got something like an 800 litre premix vat, and you're trying to load all of that in there, but you're trying to do enough for something like a 7,000 or 8,000 litre boom spray, you've got 10 times the concentration that you've got in there. So you've got a lot more granules, a lot more SCs, and not very much water. So you can have problems right from the outset in your mixing vats. A lot of the booms have great big tanks and a little small hopper, so people just go thump and dump the granules straight in there, which means that they go through a little pipe into your tank, and they can be sludged before they even really get cranked in your tank. And the other thing is, a lot of boom sprays have really fine filters. So once you've got all this floating around inside your tank, and then you start putting a lot of pressure, pump force pressure, going through very small orifices in your fine mesh filters, you can have problems at that end. Over agitation, we talked about, don't make a big foamy mess in your tank, because as more things come in, it can be problematic. And the other thing is, just because you've done this once and everything worked, don't assume that every time you do it with a different batch of chemicals, they're going to be the same, because each one has a range of different products that make up the chemical. There's some of the downfalls. The other thing that happens is people do this mixing test. They think, this is all good, it's going to mix. So they go and put their first load of that in their boom. They go up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, get to the edge of the paddock and think, I'm going to be 300 metres out into that paddock, and then I'm going to have to fill up. So while I'm over here near the fence, I'll just top up. And you end up with a slurry like this in the bottom of your boom spray, and then you try and start the process all over again, dropping granules on top of an already mixed container, and some of these can be really oily. If you had 2 litres of trifluralin and some insecticide or something like that in there, you've got a very oily brew, and then you start trying to dissolve granules in there. So that's the other thing, is either pre-mix your solution really, really well, or make sure your boom spray is empty, because often the problems will happen in the second or third or fourth load once you start to get a build-up of slurry and leftovers in your tank. That's how you do the jar test. It's part of the process, but you still have to be really careful when it comes to the big machinery. Be careful, do a jar test, test your mix, that gives you some confidence, and then go steady in your mixing process. Happy spraying. Cheers.